The system was not new. But on the night of February 3rd, it began counting people inside the building who should not have been alive. I need to explain how I know that, and I need to explain it carefully because I am still employed at this hospital, and the system is still running, and the count this morning was higher than it was yesterday. I am a systems administrator. I have held that position at Braddock County General Hospital for 9 years. The census monitoring system, the one that tracks every person inside the building at any given second, had been running in some version for over 11 years by the time I started working there. It had been patched, migrated, rebuilt on a new database backend in 2018, and tied into 3 separate subsystems covering patient intake, staff credentialing, and facility access control. It was old in the way hospital IT systems are always old, held together by documentation that half the current team has never read, and institutional memory that lives in the heads of 2 or 3 people who will eventually retire and take everything they know with them. I was one of those people. I understood the census platform better than anyone else on staff, including the vendor's own support team, who rotated through junior engineers every 18 months and never seemed to read their own release notes. I am telling you this so you understand that when the numbers stopped making sense, I was not the kind of person who panicked. I was the kind of person who opened a terminal and started reading logs. That instinct served me well for about 3 weeks. After that, it became the reason I could not stop looking. The census system does something simple. It counts who is in the building. Every person inside Braddock County General at any given moment is supposed to exist as an active entry in the census. Patients are logged at intake, assigned a bed, tracked through transfers, and logged out at discharge or, in the cases no one likes to discuss too specifically, at time of death. Staff are logged when they badge in at any exterior door and logged out when they badge out. Visitors sign in at the front desk and receive a temporary badge that pings the system at 15-minute intervals through passive RFID readers in the hallway ceilings. If a visitor badge stops pinging for more than 30 minutes, the entry grays out. If it stops for over an hour, the system marks it as departed. The system is thorough. It was designed to know, at any second, exactly how many living people are inside the building. I want you to hold on to that word, living. The system was never told to make that distinction. And as I eventually discovered, it does not. At any given time, Braddock County General has somewhere between 300 and 400 active entries. I have watched that number for 9 years. I know its rhythms, the way a fisherman knows tide charts. Tuesday mornings spike because of scheduled surgeries. Friday evenings drop because elective patients are discharged before the weekend. Night shifts settle into a low plateau around 1 a.m. when visitors are gone and only skeleton staff remains. The census has a pulse. I am used to reading it. On February 3rd of last year, the census reported 412 active entries at 2 a.m. 206 entries I could account for. 206 I could not. I noticed it because I was working late from home, remoted into the admin dashboard to run a storage maintenance script. The census count sits in the upper right corner of the dashboard. I glance at it the way you glance at a clock. Not because you need the time, but because your eye goes there out of habit. 412. I stared at it long enough for my dog to lift his head from the rug near the heating vent and look at me, the way dogs do when they sense you have stopped moving for the wrong reason. I opened the active entries list. Patient census showed 141 occupied beds, about right for that time of year. Staff entries showed 63, consistent with the overnight shift. Visitor entries showed 2, probably family members in the ICU. That added up to 206. The total read 412. The house was quiet around me. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Everything was normal, except the number on the screen that said twice as many people were inside the hospital as there should have been. I filtered the list to show only the unrecognized entries. The system tagged each entry with a source flag, indicating how it had been created. Patient entries are flagged ADM for admission. Staff entries are flagged bad for badge in. Visitor entries are flagged VIS for visitor registration. The 206 phantom entries were flagged with a code I had never seen before. 3 letters. Res. I searched every piece of documentation I had access to that night. RES was not a defined source flag in any version of the software. It did not exist in the codebase. It did not exist in the configuration files. The system was using a word it had never been taught. Each phantom entry had a record structure identical to a standard staff entry: a name field, a badge number field, a department field, a timestamp for entry, a location field showing which RFID reader had last detected them. The names were full names, first and last, formatted correctly. The badge numbers were 7 digits, consistent with the hospital's numbering scheme but in a range that had never been issued. The departments were real departments within Braddock County General. And the timestamps were all identical: 1:47 a.m., February 3rd. Every single one of them had entered the building at the same moment. The location fields showed them distributed across the entire hospital: 3rd floor, basement, east wing, ER, chapel. As if 206 people had materialized simultaneously and walked in different directions. I assumed it was a database error, a corrupted batch insertion. I queried the database directly and checked the insertion logs. The entries had been written at 1:47 a.m. The insertion originated from the census service itself, not an external script, not the badge reader interface, not the patient intake module. The census had generated these entries through its normal monitoring process, as if it had simply detected 206 new presences and done what it was built to do. Then I checked the RFID reader logs, and the normal explanations stopped working. The readers are the physical layer of the census. They send out a radio pulse. A badge absorbs the energy and transmits its number back. No chip, no response, no badge, no detection. This is physics, not software. If the phantom entries were ghosts in the database, the readers should show nothing, but the reader logs showed pings. Every one of the 206 entries had a corresponding detection event on a physical RFID reader. 206 badge detections distributed across the entire building, all at the same second. Something had answered the readers, something carrying badge numbers that had never been manufactured. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. The timestamp said 3:14 a.m. My coffee was cold. The dog had gone back to sleep. I stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the house settle around me, trying to find the part of this that fit inside the world I understood. An RFID reader cannot detect a badge that does not exist. The reader sends a radio pulse. The chip responds. No chip, no signal. This is not software. This is physics. And physics does not make exceptions because it is 3 a.m. and you would prefer a simpler explanation. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about 206 radio pulses bouncing back from things that should not exist. I did not sleep well. That was not unusual. But the reason was. The next morning, I drove to the hospital. Braddock County General sits on the west side of town, a 4-story concrete building from the 1990s, with a newer glass-fronted addition from 2010. It always looks tired from the outside, like a building that has been working too many shifts. I went directly to the server room on the 2nd floor of the east wing, behind a badge-controlled door that only 4 people can access. The corridor leading to it smells faintly of hot plastic and the vending machine near the stairwell. I logged into the census system locally. Active count, 309. Normal for 8 a.m. I filtered for res entries. 0. They were gone. All 206 phantom entries had been cleared from the active census. I checked the database logs. The deletions had occurred at 5:58 a.m., 12 minutes before the day shift began. Logged as a routine census reconciliation, a process that runs every 6 hours to clear stale visitor entries. But res entries were not visitor entries. The reconciliation script targets entries flagged VIS with no ping in 60 minutes. That is all it does. I pulled the script and read it line by line, unchanged. It should not have touched the res entries. But the deletion log said it had. Something had either altered the flags on every phantom entry before the reconciliation ran, or the reconciliation had expanded its scope through a process I could not see. And here is the part that made me sit very still for a long time. The phantom entries had not simply been deleted. They had been moved to the history table with departure timestamps. Arrival, 1:47 a.m. Departure, 5:58 a.m., 4 hours and 11 minutes. And every record included a full sequence of RFID pings showing movement through the building during those 4 hours. Movement. The phantom entries had not been static. After materializing at 1:47 a.m., each one had moved. The RFID logs showed them pinging different readers over the course of the night. Individual routes, different from each other. Some covered short distances. Some traversed the entire facility multiple times. They moved at intervals, consistent with walking speed. They paused at locations for varying amounts of time, as if stopping at rooms, standing in hallways, waiting. 206 invisible presences, moving through a hospital full of sleeping patients for 4 hours, following routes that looked, from the data, exactly like people making rounds. I leaned back from the monitor. The server fans whirred. The overhead light had that faint flicker it always had, the one I kept meaning to report to facilities and never did. I thought about the overnight nurses who had been working those floors while this was happening, walking the same hallways, passing the same readers. And the system had been tracking both populations simultaneously, the visible one and the other one, as if there were no difference between them. I reported the anomaly to my supervisor, Helen Marsh, the hospital's Director of Information Services. Helen is practical and skeptical in the way that people who manage hospital IT become after enough years of problems that are simultaneously urgent and unfundable. I showed her everything: the census logs, the RFID data, the phantom entries, the movement patterns. She looked at it for about 15 minutes, her reading glasses low on her nose, her office quiet except for the wall clock. Then she told me to run a full audit of all open admission records with blank discharge fields and close them manually. She said the phantom entries were a data integrity issue. Orphaned records interacting with a monitoring process that expected every record to have a resolution. Fix the data, do not build a theory. I told her the RFID detections could not be explained by orphaned records. She said the system was probably backfilling location data to make the entries look consistent. I started to explain why that was not technically possible, that the reader hardware operates independently of the census software, that the detection events are logged at the firmware level before they reach the census service. She held up her hand. She said she understood, but the correct response was to fix the immediate problem. That is how hospital administrators think. Contain the anomaly, close the tickets, move on. It is usually the right approach. I want to be clear about that. Helen was not being negligent. She was being rational, and rationality, in this case, was exactly the wrong tool. I ran the audit. I found 219 open admission records with blank discharge fields spanning 12 years. 206 matched the phantom census entries. Every phantom name corresponded to a former patient who had been admitted, assigned a bed, and then vanished from the system without documentation of discharge, transfer, or death. Blank fields. Open records. 12 years of patients the system still believed were inside the building. I began closing them, patient by patient. Administrative closure, records reconciliation, current date, my employee ID, tedious work. I did about 40 on the first day. And that is when I learned that the phantom entries were not the problem. They were the structure, and I had just started pulling it apart. At 4 p.m., a nurse on the 3rd floor called the help desk. 2 patient beds were showing as unoccupied in the tracking system, even though patients were physically lying in them. Active admissions. Valid entries. Working wristbands. Working readers. But the census showed the beds as empty. The location pings had gone silent. I rechecked my work from that morning. 2 of the 40 phantom records I had closed had last pinged near those beds. Within hours of deleting the phantom occupants, the real occupants nearby had become invisible to the system. By end of day, 3 more reports. A staff badge stopped working at a door she used daily. A visitor badge expired 4 hours early. A patient in the ICU briefly vanished from the telemetry system, triggering a false code alarm that sent a crash team sprinting to a bedside where the patient was sitting up eating applesauce, alive and confused by the commotion. Every affected location was near a spot where I had closed a phantom record that morning. I was not cleaning the database. I was destabilizing it. The phantom entries were load-bearing. They were part of the architecture. Removing them created voids, and the system filled those voids by dropping the nearest real entries. As if presence inside the building were a finite resource, and the phantoms had been holding space that the living needed but could not hold on their own. I stayed late that night. I needed to see if the pattern held. At 1:47 a.m., the census reported 426 active entries. The phantom entries were back. Not the same ones. New ones. The badge sequence had shifted, picking up exactly where the previous batch ended. And these new entries did not correspond to Braddock County General's records. They came from other hospitals. Facilities connected to the same regional health information exchange. The system had reached outward, pulling unresolved admissions from other buildings and logging them as present in ours. By morning, the 40 records I had closed the day before were active again, readmitted at 1:47 a.m. with new timestamps. As if my closure had been a discharge and the system had simply readmitted them the following night. I was not fixing the problem. I was feeding it. Every record I closed gave the system a reason to expand. I stopped closing records. I told Helen what had happened, including the real patients who had dropped off the census after I deleted nearby phantoms. She was quiet for longer than I expected. The clock on her wall ticked. She turned a pen over in her fingers twice before speaking. Then she asked how many phantom entries the system was generating per night. 231. Was it increasing? Yes, 12 to 15 per night. She asked me to project when the count would exceed the facility's licensed bed capacity. I ran the numbers. 6 weeks. At that point, the census would automatically notify the county fire marshal and the state health department, an overcapacity alert mandated by state code. Helen told me to disable the alert. I said I could not without written authorization from the hospital administrator. She said she would get it. She told me to keep the situation internal. I want to be honest about what I felt at this point. Not fear. Not yet. Something more specific. The feeling of working inside a system that was smarter than me. Not more powerful. Smarter. The census was solving a problem I did not understand, using methods I could not replicate, and every time I tried to correct it, it corrected me. I am not accustomed to being outperformed by software I maintain. That feeling, more than any data point, is what made me keep looking when I should have closed the ticket and gone home. That changed on February 11th. Not the feeling, everything else. I was at the hospital late, around 10 p.m., finishing a server migration. The server room at night has a particular quality. The machines run hotter because the building management system drops AC output after hours. The air is warm and close. The fans are louder without the daytime sounds of the building to mask them. I was watching progress bars and verifying checksums, the kind of work that requires attention but not thought, when my phone buzzed. A proximity alert from the census system, an active entry within close range of my location. Badge number 2281101. The first badge in the original Phantom sequence. Name, Robert Ash. Department, Internal Medicine. Last reader detection, reader 2E03. That reader was 15 feet from the server room door. I set my phone on the desk. I looked at the door. Solid, no window, heavy enough to muffle most hallway sound. I sat very still, and I listened. Server fans, power supply, hum, hard drive, whine. And then, from the corridor outside, the chirp of a badge reader. Chirp, pause. Chirp, pause. A repeated chirp means the badge is moving in and out of detection range, stepping away and stepping back, over and over, rhythmically. I counted the chirps without deciding to count them. 47. Over 11 minutes. Then they stopped. I checked the census. Badge 2281101 had moved to the 3rd floor. Robert Ashe had left. I sat in the warm hum of the server room for a while after that. My hands were on the desk. The migration progress bar had completed while I was counting chirps. The screen was waiting for input. I was not ready to give it any. Something carrying a badge that had never been manufactured had stood in the hallway outside my door for 11 minutes, pacing in and out of the reader's range. And the only barrier between us had been a door I now wished had a window, and also a door I was deeply grateful did not. I finished the migration. I opened the door. The corridor was empty. Fluorescent lights on their overnight setting, every other fixture, strips of light and shadow on the linoleum. The air was cooler out here. I stood in the doorway, letting it settle on my face. Floor polish, antiseptic, the smell of a hospital that never fully sleeps. Nothing was there, nothing I could see. I drove home, but something had shifted. I had been treating the phantom entries as data, numbers in a system. The chirps outside the door made them something else, something with location, something with behavior, something that stood in hallways and paced. The next morning, I looked up Robert Ashe, admitted 8 years ago, chest pain, 4th floor, room 401, length of stay, 2 days, discharge field, blank. His admission record had a note I had not read before, entered by an attending physician whose name I did not recognize. Patient admitted for evaluation. Symptoms inconsistent with cardiac event. Monitoring requested. See attached. There was no attachment. I went to the Physical Medical Records archive in the basement, a room lined with metal shelving, filled with paper charts in manila folders. It smells like aging paper and old adhesive, and the faintly sweet odor of label glue that has been drying for years. I found Robert Ashe's folder, thin. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not a medical chart, not a physician's note. A printout of a census report from the night of Robert Ashe's admission 8 years ago. Active entries at 1:47 a.m. Patient count normal. Staff count normal, visitor count 0, and at the bottom, below the standard entries, a section I had never seen in any census report format, labeled monitoring. Under that heading was one entry, my name, my badge number, my department, and a timestamp, 1:47 a.m., February 11th of last year, the night I had been in the server room, the night the chirps came, a date that was, when this document was printed, 8 years in the future. I put the paper down on the metal shelf. The archive was cold. I could hear the heating pipes ticking somewhere behind the walls. My hands were dry. I stood there looking at my name on a document that was older than my career at this hospital, and I waited for the part of my brain that solves problems to offer something. It remained silent. I went back to the server room. I queried the database for any hidden table matching a monitoring section. Nothing in production, nothing in test. I went through the monthly backup snapshots year by year. In the snapshot from 6 years ago, I found it, a table called Census, Monitoring. 4 columns, entry, ID, name, badge, reference, observation, date. 17 records. The names were not patients. They were IT staff, current and former employees of my department. 12 of the 17 were people I knew. My name was on the list. My observation date, February 11th, the night the chirps came. And one more name I recognized, Helen Marsh, my supervisor. Observation date, March 3rd, 3 weeks away. I remember standing up from my chair and walking to the hallway map pinned to the server room wall and staring at it for almost a full minute before the thought arrived. The table had been created 6 years ago, but it was hidden, not deleted, hidden, still physically present on the database disk but invisible to normal queries. Someone or something had altered the metadata to conceal it while leaving the data intact. I made it visible. I read the current contents. 23 entries now, 6 more than the 6-year-old snapshot. New hires added. Helen's date unchanged, March 3rd. I looked at the people who had already passed their observation dates. 3 resigned within a year, 2 transferred, 1 retired early, 1 took medical leave and never returned. 5 were still here. people I worked with every day. I thought about Marcus Reed, network engineer, observation date 2 years ago, competent, reliable, quiet. After his date, he had become quieter, more precise in his language. He stopped eating in the cafeteria, brought his lunch and ate at his desk, facing his monitors, even when the rest of us went downstairs. I had attributed it to burnout. I thought about Karen Lyle, observation date 18 months ago, used to volunteer for after-hours maintenance. After her date, she stopped. She worked her exact shift and left. She no longer accessed the server room alone. I had attributed it to better work-life boundaries. Small changes, the kind you notice only when you have a reason to look at them differently. I made a decision I have examined many times since and still cannot defend. I did not tell Helen about the census monitoring table. Her observation date was 3 weeks away. I did not know what observation meant. And I wanted to see what happened. I wanted data. I told myself this was professional necessity, that understanding the system was the only way to fix it, that I needed to observe the process before I could interrupt it. All of that was true. But it was also true that I was choosing to let my supervisor walk into something without warning her, because my need to understand was stronger than my duty to protect. That is my flaw. I have always valued comprehension over caution. I have always been willing to let other people bear the cost of my curiosity, as long as I could frame it as diagnosis. March 3rd came. Helen worked her normal shift and left at 5:30 p.m. I watched the census from home that night. At 1:47 a.m., the phantom entries appeared as usual. The nightly count was now over 300. And at the same moment, a new entry appeared. Not flagged res, flagged Mon, Helen Marsh. Her real badge number. Location, 2nd floor, East Wing, the server room. Helen was not in the building. Her last badge out was 5:32 p.m. She had not returned, but the census placed her in the server room at 1:47 a.m. I drove to the hospital. I know I should not have. I know that every rational principle I claim to operate by should have kept me home. But I have already told you about my flaw, and here it was again, dressed as professional diligence, sitting in the driver's seat, turning the key. I badged in at the east entrance at 2:15 a.m. The hallway was empty. My footsteps were too sharp on the tile, the way footsteps sound in a building that is trying to be asleep. I walked to the 2nd floor corridor, stopped outside the server room. The reader chirped. Once, I checked my phone. 2 entries at reader, 2E03, my badge. And Helen Marsh, flagged Mon. I stood in that corridor, and I looked at the space between me and the door. Empty air, fluorescent light, linoleum, fire extinguisher in its glass case. Hand sanitizer dispenser with a slow drip stain beneath it, and something else, not visible, not audible in any way I could point to and name. A presence that I perceived the way you perceive someone standing behind you in a quiet room, not through any one sense, through the absence of aloneness. A rhythm beneath the building sounds that did not match my breathing, not labored, not loud, just there, the way a second person's breathing is there when you are close to someone, in the dark. I stood for 9 minutes. The chirps continued at irregular intervals. I counted them because counting gave me something to do that was not thinking about what stood between me and the door. On March 4th, Helen came to work and was Helen. Same voice, same coffee, same quarterly infrastructure meeting, same reading glasses. But from that day forward, she never entered the server room alone. She never stayed past 5 p.m. She did not explain the change. She did not acknowledge there was a change. If you asked her, she would tell you she was delegating more hands-on work to the team, and her voice, when she said it, would be perfectly steady. I checked the census, monitoring table. Helen's entry had a new field, status, the value, resident. The others who had passed their observation dates and remained at the hospital all showed the same status, resident, the ones who resigned or transferred, discharged. Resident, the word a hospital uses for a patient who has been admitted and remains. The census was not tracking staff observations. It was tracking admissions. We were being admitted, processed, reclassified, not as employees who worked in the building, as occupants who belonged to it. I understood then what the phantom entries were. Not glitches, not orphan data. They were the previous residents. Patients admitted years ago whose records were never closed. People the census still counted as present because, in whatever way it measured presence, they had never left. The census was the only honest system in the building. It saw what we could not. It counted what we refused to count. And now it was doing the same thing to us. And I understood why deleting the phantom records had caused real patients to disappear from nearby beds. The phantoms were not parasites. They were infrastructure. They held space in the system's awareness. When I removed them, the system compensated by releasing the nearest real entries, because presence was finite. The building could sustain a fixed number of active entries in its attention, and the dead had seniority. They had been counted longer. In a system that never discharged its oldest occupants, the living were always the most expendable. That is why I stopped deleting records. Not because I surrendered, because I understood the cost. Every phantom I erased meant a real patient flickering out of the system somewhere, a wristband going silent, a bed showing empty on a nurse's screen, a living person ceasing to exist in the hospital's digital awareness for minutes or hours. And in a building where medication schedules, emergency responses, and life support protocols all run through that digital awareness, disappearing from the system is not an abstraction. It is a gap in care that no one can see because the system says there is no one there to care for. The weeks after that settled into something I can only describe as a quiet horror, not the kind that makes you run. The kind that makes you show up for work and sit at your desk and do your job while knowing that the building around you is twice as full as anyone believes. The nightly count passed 300, then 350. During the day, everything was normal. Patients were treated. Staff rotated through shifts. The cafeteria served the same overcooked green beans. The parking lot filled and emptied. Nothing visible changed. But at night, the building was full. I built a custom dashboard, a floor plan overlay that tracked the phantom entries in real time. Each phantom appeared as a blue dot. Verified staff were green. Patients were yellow. After 1:47 a.m., the floor plan bloomed with blue. Hundreds of dots moving through hallways, pausing in rooms, clustering in waiting areas and stairwells. They used the hallways. They used the elevators. They did not pass through walls. They avoided collision paths with the green and yellow dots, adjusting their routes the way people adjust when they see someone coming the other direction. Certain phantoms returned to the same locations every night. Patricia Voss, badge 2, 281178. Spent most of her time on the 4th floor near room 412, the room she had been admitted to 7 years ago. David Cowell, badge 228123, lingered in the basement near the facilities office. They went to places that meant something to their identities, both their patient histories and their fabricated staff roles, as if two versions of who they had been were pulling them in different directions, and the building was large enough to hold both. I began staying later, not because my job required it, because I was watching. I would sit in the server room with the dashboard open and track the blue dots as they moved through the building around me. The corridor outside would fill with phantom pings, and I would hear things, not voices, not footsteps, sounds at the edge of what I could identify. The soft tone of an elevator arriving at a floor where no one had pressed the button, a badge reader chirping in a wing closed for renovation. The faint displacement of air under the server room door, a pressure change that meant a door had opened or closed in a connected hallway, carrying with it the smell of floor polish from a corridor I could not see into. One night in late March, the desk phone rang. Not my cell, the server room landline, connected to the hospital's internal PBX system. It rang twice and stopped. Caller ID, extension 4012, 4th floor, room 412, Patricia Voss's room, the room that was, at 2 a.m., occupied by a post-surgical patient who was almost certainly asleep. I picked up the phone and dialed 4012. It rang 6 times. No answer, no voicemail. just ringing into a room where a living patient slept and a blue dot stood stationary on my dashboard, occupying the same coordinates, existing in the same space, separated by nothing I could measure and everything I could not explain. 2 entries, 1 room, 1 visible, 1 not. Helen approved the suppression of the overcapacity alert in mid-March. She filed the authorization herself. The State Health Department was not notified. The fire marshal was not notified. The building's official occupancy showed a normal hospital operating within licensed capacity. The census told a different story. But the census was the only system no one was listening to anymore, except me. In early April, a new field appeared in my census, monitoring record. I checked it the way I checked everything. First thing in the morning, coffee in hand, server room door closed. Status still red resident. But now there was a second field, labeled role. The value was 1 word, administrator. I set my coffee down. The cursor blinked. Outside the server room, the morning shift was starting. Carts rolling, doors opening, voices in the hallway. The building waking into its daytime self, the version that followed rules everyone agreed on. I closed the query window and walked to the break room. The coffee from the carafe tasted the way it always did. Burnt, metallic. I stood holding the cup while 2 nurses talked about a show I had never seen, and I felt the distance between their world and mine, and the distance was exactly the width of a database table that nobody else could see. The count kept climbing. 400, 450. The system reached into hospital networks across 4 states. Every unclosed record, every missing discharge, every patient who entered a building somewhere and never left according to the data. It found them. It placed them here. It filled the hallways of Braddock County General with people from hospitals hundreds of miles away, because the system did not recognize distance. It recognized only 2 states, admitted and not admitted. And if you were admitted and never discharged, you were here. You had always been here. Geography was a human concern. The census had no use for it. And then, last week, the census monitoring table added a new name. Not a Braddock County General employee, not hospital staff of any kind. The entry had an observation date, a badge reference, and a location. But the location field contained a data string I had to look up in the RFID vendor's technical documentation to decode. It took me 20 minutes. The string corresponded to a reader type not installed in our building, classified in the vendor specifications as extended range, passive, non-facility. A reader designed to detect presence outside the building. I sat in my chair, and I felt something I had not felt through this entire process. Not curiosity, not frustration, fear. The specific kind that begins in your stomach and spreads upward into your chest and changes the way you breathe. Because the system had been counting people inside, within the walls, within the boundary of what the building could monitor. And now it was reaching beyond the walls. It was preparing to count someone who was not inside, someone who might never have been inside any hospital at all. The name field is populated. I can see the character length in the column width. It is sitting there in the table, waiting for me to run the query that will display it. The observation date is still weeks away. I have not looked at the name. I come to work every day. I maintain the database. I run the backups. I make sure the records are clean, consistent, and complete. That is my job. Both of my jobs. The one the hospital pays me for and the one the hidden table assigned me. They feel less different every week. Some mornings I badge in and I am not sure which role I am fulfilling. Some mornings I think there is no difference and that there never was. Helen and I do not discuss the census anymore. Marcus eats lunch at his desk. Karen leaves at exactly 5. The server room hums. The readers chirp in empty hallways. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the building goes quiet and the blue dots begin to appear on my dashboard, I hear the elevator arrive on the 2nd floor. The doors open. No one steps out. The doors close. The census logs one more ping on reader 2E01, and I add it to the record, because that is what administrators do. The count this morning was 703. I have not looked at the new name. But the observation date is getting closer, and the system does not wait for anyone to be ready. It admits you when the record opens. It assigns you a location the moment the reader finds you, and it has already decided where you belong.